"You are too sensitive for this job," he said, and the room went quiet like someone had turned off the lights. I felt my face go hot. The board members were looking at me. My voice stuck in my throat. He had said it loud enough that the client could hear, and then he smiled like he had done me a favor. "My name is Anissa, and I ran the operations risk team at HarborLink Logistics. I worked on the warehouse side, but my job touched everything downstream. I built processes, wrote acceptance checklists, and owned the go or no-go sign for major vendor integrations. The contract in question was a $500,000 renewal with Northridge Foods. That contract paid for an automated pick and pack integration with a new vendor we were testing on our freight flow scheduling platform. If it worked, it would shave 2 hours off the busiest days and keep us from hiring 2 temp teams for the summer. If it failed, we would not only pay penalty fees, but we would lose shelf space with 2 of Northridge Foods' largest grocery clients. 2 weeks before the renewal meeting, I had sent a 6-point risk memo to my department head, Mark Rivers, the procurement director. I highlighted a single point of failure. The vendor was asking us to accept an exception to our standard quality gate. That exception would exempt them from the end-to-end reconciliation step for batches over 10,000 units. I had tested their code in a sandbox, and the reconciliation failed intermittently under load. I wrote the failure rates, the test logs, and the exact scenario in the memo. I also attached the ticket exports from our internal system that showed 6 prior incidents during the pilot. I asked for 1 additional week to run a staged smoke test and get a formal acceptance certificate from Northridge Foods. He read it on his tablet in the delivery bay while he was on his way to a board meeting in meeting room 3B. He told me in the hall, "We have to be decisive. The numbers look fine to me." I said, "Can we at least hold the signature until Friday after the stage test?" I kept my voice low. I breathed in, because I could feel myself getting worked up. He looked at me like I was slowing him down. He said, "We cannot waste the client. Sign-off is happening today." I did something small and calm. I walked away and documented it. I sent a calendar invite to the board meeting with the memo attached, 5 minutes before it started. I created a ticket referencing the memo and linked it to the contract file. I printed out the 3 failing test logs and left them on my manager's desk. I did not argue in front of the board. I did not raise my voice. I smiled politely when he introduced the renewal as a done deal. Then in meeting room 3B, directly after I had explained the risk in front of the client, he leaned in and said, "You are too sensitive for this job." It was not even a quiet aside. The client winced. One of the board members laughed. Mark then reworded my warning in his own language and assured the client the issue was minor and that HarborLink Logistics had total confidence in the vendor. He signed the contract in the meeting, initialed the exception clause, and shook the client representative's hand. 2 days later, the first problems began. The vendor pushed their new release into our production freight flow scheduling pipeline at midnight. That morning, we woke to 15 urgent tickets, starting with T1023 and ending with T1037. The warehouse scanners were misrouting pallets. Batch counts were off by 4%. One of the largest grocery clients called and said they had 500 missing cases on the shelf. We paid $30,000 overnight to expedite freight to cover the shortage. Mark blamed the vendor, but his signature was on the exception clause that removed the reconciliation gate. He said to me in the operations war room, "This is vendor error, not our process." I took a breath and I said, "The exception you approved removed the safety net." I did not shout. I kept a clear voice. He did not like that I had the record. Over the next 4 days, the situation spiraled. The vendor pushed a hotfix. That hotfix created race conditions because it assumed reconciliation was happening in the background. 22 more tickets poured in, T1038 through T1060. Inventory mismatches, timestamp mismatches, delays in pick routes. A Northridge Foods account manager sent an email at 10:30 p.m. on the 6th, with subject line, "Shipment shortfall on 406. The email said they were considering invoking the penalty clause from the contract if we did not fix shipment accuracy by weekend. Mark forwarded that client email to our operations distribution list and copied our leadership team, adding, "Anissa is leading the team on this." He did not copy my risk memo. I had a second calm moment then. The operations director called for a quick mitigation plan meeting. People wanted to escalate and point fingers. I kept my responses short and focused. I said, "We can isolate the affected batches and reprocess. I have the rollback steps in ticket T1019. I smiled politely while other voices rose. I documented every decision. I updated the ticket log with timestamps for each mitigation step. I saved screenshots of the vendor dashboard showing the release time. I saved the change request that showed Mark's approval. I did not argue with him in the hallway. I made sure the record showed the flow from my memo to the approval to the deployment. By day 9, we had 57 tickets in the system related to the release. They ranged from T1023 to T1079. Each ticket had timestamps. The internal ticket system had export logs that showed when each ticket was created, which code release ID was referenced, and which user had signed the deployment approval. I exported the file into a spreadsheet and created a mapping that showed a clear spike right after the release ID linked to the exception clause. I labeled the spreadsheet Harbor Link ticket Spike April and saved it in a folder named Audit Evidence with a date stamp. The third escalation happened when Mark tried to pin everything on me. He sent an email to the leadership team with subject line, Operational Oversight Failure. He wrote, "Despite warnings, ANISA failed to enforce the test gate." He attached a one-page timeline that started with my memo but had a glaring omission. It removed the calendar invite that showed I had attached the test logs. He told the operations director that he had been the one who rescued the client with a quick patch and that my reluctance had been the problem. He asked human resources to be briefed. He even spoke to 2 board members privately. One of them started asking pointed questions at lunch. For the first time since I joined HarborLink Logistics, I thought I might not survive the week at my job. I had a genuine low point 3 days later. An email arrived from Human Resources that asked me to come in for a meeting. The subject line was soft, quick catch-up. The message had a carbon copy to the operations director and the procurement director. I sat in the Human Resources office in a hard chair and listened as the Human Resources representative said, "There are concerns about your judgment on the North Ridge Foods contract. We need your side documented." She was polite. My stomach felt like a stone. I had visions of being put on a formal corrective action plan, which would ruin my record and make it hard to move anywhere for a year. I could have exploded. I could have cried. Instead, I took a breath and I said, "I will bring everything you need." I stayed calm. I went straight back to my desk and pulled the audit folder. I printed the original memo. I printed the calendar invite with the attachment showing the failing logs. I printed the ticket export spreadsheet with the timestamps and the release ID. I printed the incoming client email that threatened the penalty clause. I made a timeline and stapled it together, and then I put a copy in an envelope and hand-delivered it to the Human Resources office. I also sent an email to the operations director and copied Human Resources with the subject, "Evidence for North Ridge Foods issue." The email said, "Please find the attached timeline, ticket export, and my original memo. I have kept full documentation throughout." I had been quietly building leverage for weeks because I believed in the work. The small habit of saving receipts after vendor calls, of always sending a follow-up with meeting notes, of asking for written confirmations, had created a trail. I had saved the conference call log from the pilot stand-up on March 18th. I had email quotes from the vendor engineer saying they were aware of the intermittent failure. I had a vendor receipt for a troubleshooting invoice for $850. I had the calendar invites and meeting minutes from the pilot review. I had a junior analyst I had mentored, Priya, who had been logging the warehouse scanner errors and building the dashboard of real-time exceptions. She had been quiet, but she believed in data. When I asked her to run a correlation, she came back with a heat map showing errors spiking within 2 minutes of the release timestamp. The turning point came at a scheduled executive review meeting, arranged by the client and our leadership to decide next steps. North Ridge Foods had requested a joint session with our board because of the scale of the disruption. We were in meeting room 3B again. It felt like a bad déjà vu. The client representative was there. The operations director sat on my left. Mark was on my right. The room was full and the tension was thick. Mark opened the meeting with a prepared slide deck that framed the issue as a vendor incident. He said, "We accepted the vendor identity and moved forward. We are working with them on fixes." He smiled at the client. The client looked skeptical. Then someone from the client asked a specific question. "Who authorized the exception to the reconciliation gate and when?" It was quiet. Mark cleared his throat. I had one version of the evidence printed and in a folder labeled Evidence for Executive Review. I had my spreadsheet mapped to the ticket series T1023 through T1079. I had the calendar invite printouts, the vendor receipts, the March 18th conference call log, and the client penalty email. I spoke up calmly. I said, "I have the timeline here. If you want, I can walk us through it." He started to interrupt. I held up my hand and smiled like I was not about to start a fight. The room stopped. I walked through the timeline one step at a time. I stated dates and times. I said, on April 2nd at 9:10 a.m., I sent the memo highlighting the reconciliation exception. On April 2nd at 9:28 a.m., I attached the sandbox failure logs to the calendar invite for this board meeting. On April 2nd at 9:45 a.m., the board met and the exception was initialed. I placed each printed item on the table in front of our operations director, in front of the client, and in front of Mark. I walked them through the ticket export. I showed the release identification number and matched it to the vendor push time stamped at 2 a.m. on April 3rd. I showed the client penalty threat email with the timestamp of 10:30 p.m. on April 6th. Mark's face went white. He tried to reach for one of the printouts. I kept my hand on the paper. He said, "This is not how I remember it. Anissa, you seemed hesitant." I said, "I asked for 1 week of stage testing and I documented that request." I stammered only once and then I found my voice. I told him I did not block the client. I wanted to protect this company from losing 2 grocery accounts and from paying the penalty clause. An unexpected thing happened then. Priya, the junior analyst, spoke up. She said, "I matched error spikes to the release ID. I can show you the dashboard if you want." She pulled up her laptop and projected the heat map. The pattern was unambiguous. The client watched it, silent. Then an operations director from another division asked the internal ticket system administrator to pull the change approval audit log. The administrator did it on the spot. It showed 2 approvals, one from Mark Rivers at 9:50 p.m. on April 2nd and one from a vendor integration bot at 2 a.m. on April 3rd. But the bot's deployment entry showed the full release notes with a flagged line. Exception clause applied as per approval signature dated 9:50 p.m. The sequence showed that the signature came after the initial board meeting audio. There was a 20-minute gap where Mark had left and then returned to initial the clause. We were not in a courtroom. We were in a conference room, but the evidence sat on the table like iron. The client asked a simple question. Why was the exception approved if there was a failing test log in the memo? Mark's face collapsed. He looked at the operations director and the client and then down at the table. He said, "I took responsibility and I signed the exception. I thought the vendor issue was low impact." His voice was quieter than I had ever heard from him. Then he did something I had not expected. He tried to deflect one last time by saying, "Anissa, you could have escalated more." I held eye contact and pushed the folder slightly toward the operations director, not toward Mark. I said nothing more. I had already said everything I needed to say. The public reversal was not an instant sacking. HarborLink Logistics did not fire him the next day. This was also not about spectacle. The company had processes, but things shifted fast. Leadership opened an official procurement review. The board asked for a full audit of approval flows for the quarter. Human Resources began a performance review for Mark focused on decision-making and risk management. The operations director reassigned vendor exceptions to a new formal committee rather than letting one person sign off. That committee later flagged 3 prior exceptions Mark had approved without adequate documentation. That pattern mattered to the board. During the week after the review, Mark called me 3 times asking me to return to the operations floor to help put out fires because he claimed he could not find the root cause. He asked me to fix the last critical ticket T1079, which was a warehouse routing logic error that would restore normal pick accuracy. He said, "Just fix it and we will move on." The first time he called, I listened. Then I told him, "I will not be your emergency fix after you bypass the gates." I stayed calm. I did not raise my voice. I refused politely, and then I forwarded the technical ownership to the vendor liaison and the new committee. That refusal was sweet in a way I had not expected. He expected me to be the one who ran in and saved his reputation. He expected me to quietly fix his mistake while he kept the client-facing credit. I stayed firm. He had asked me to ride to his rescue. I chose not to. Letting him struggle forced leadership to see that his decision had real costs and consequences. It also set me free to pursue a different path. There was another unexpected detail. The Northridge Foods account manager had kept recordings of the initial renewal call because their company policy required recorded decisions. They provided that audio to our board when they asked for clarity. The audio showed Mark presenting the exception as a finalized item and then saying, "We can waive the gate. HarborLink Logistics can handle fallout." That line sounded like a promise. It weighed on the board more than I thought any memo could. I had not known the client kept that recording until the day of the review. 2 weeks after the board meeting, the formal personnel outcome landed on Mark's desk. He was put on a formal performance plan for 6 months. His procurement privileges were suspended pending retraining. The new committee took over exceptions temporarily. The board instituted a requirement that any waiver to an acceptance gate required a joint sign-off from procurement, operations risk, and the legal compliance officer. The penalty clause for the Northridge Foods contract was negotiated down because the client appreciated the transparency and the new controls. We paid a portion of the expedited freight and absorbed the rest. For me, the result was cleaner than I expected. Human Resources closed their file on me with a note that said, "Evidence supported that I followed process and raised concerns in good faith." The operations director publicly acknowledged my documentation and my calm handling in the review meeting. My work was recognized in the quarter-end notes as a reason the company avoided larger losses. 2 companies actually reached out with offers. One was an in-house position overseeing vendor integrations for a rival regional logistics provider. The other was an internal opening that allowed me to step into a director role for operations risk across all warehouses. I chose the internal director role. It felt right to stay, to help fix the process from within, and to take the responsibilities I had been asking for all along. When I walked out of the building to hand in my final transition notes, Mark was still there. He did not reach out. He later emailed a short message that said, "You handled yourself well in the review." I replied with one sentence. I kept it short and neutral. I said, "I did my job." He never asked me to come back to fix anything. If there is a lesson here, it is simple. Keep your records, speak clearly, and stay calm. Anger makes stories messy. Documentation makes them understandable. The satisfaction was not in watching someone fall. It was in the moment the facts became larger than someone's charm, and good process mattered more than a quick applause.